Jim Hemphill, and the guests first to my immediate left is Director of Photography Lawrence Sher. And next to him we have co-writer, producer, and director Todd Phillips. So, by my count, this is the 6th movie you guys have done together, I think. So I'm curious what your initial conversations are like. Todd, how early do you bring Larry into the process in a movie like this? Do you talk to him when you're writing it? Do you wait until you're done and just give him the script? What were the...
I think I tell him what we're writing about, but I show Larry pretty early drafts. I don't know about the very first drafts. We write a lot of drafts. Like anybody who writes in the room, there's probably... The movie we shot's probably the 22nd draft, but I go to Larry pretty early and try to get him hired pretty early, like on, so we could start scouting and talking about it. You know, we do a very long prep as long as the budget allows for, because I've learned working with him for so long, it's just the more time the better, the more it can get into his blood and sort of run through him, and the more conversations we could have, the more helpful it's been.
So, Larry, what was your initial response to the script? I mean, did Todd tell you anything to kind of, you know, when you went into it, did you know what you were getting into, or was it just, here's my Joker origin story? I mean, you know, how did you come into it?
It was really not a lot outside of, I think I got this really cool idea about how to use the sort of the IP and the legend of sort of Joker, but do it in a way that's a character study. And that's kind of, I feel like, all I knew before he sent me the script. Because I remember I was in Atlanta when we talked, and I was just blown away. I expected a lot, because you know, everything he writes is really good, and even the movies that we've taken over, I never really consider them a script until he's done a pass on them, you know, like, and so I know this was one that he was writing from the start, as opposed to finding a piece of material like he did maybe with Hangover or Due Date, and then shaping it and making it himself. But yeah, I was super excited, because obviously it reads much like the movie on the page. Very visual, super complex in terms of the character study, and so it just immediately got me really excited.
It's kind of interesting, because I've seen the movie a bunch of times now, and the first time I wasn't really thinking that much about it as a DC Joker movie, but now as I've seen it a few times, I mean, there actually is like a lot of stuff in it that connects it to that universe, and I'm curious how you approached kind of reverse engineering the Joker character. Like, what were you looking at other movies, at the comic books? Like, where did you take the things that you took from that, and how did you decide which elements you were going to use?
We really were able to just kind of cherry pick what worked for our story, but it was exactly that. It was backwards engineering. So the goal of the whole movie was to make a comic book film that we ran through as realistic a lens as possible. So things, what do we know about Joker? Oh, Joker has this laugh from the comics or even the movies. He has this laugh. Well, why would he have that laugh? Okay, maybe he has a condition. Joker wears white paint and, you know, green hair. In the comics, he fell into a vat of acid and his skin turned white. That didn't feel real to us, that's not what would happen if you fell into a vat of acid. So, oh, maybe he does it because maybe he's a clown and that's his look. And it was just this sort of really backwards engineering of all the things that we wanted to, all the big things that we all know about that character Joker that's been around for 80 years. But we found the one thing we didn't do was really look back much at the films, and even the comics. We really just took the surface things we knew. We didn't want to look back at the films because it would have been paralyzing to us to look at Nolan's films or Tim Burton's movies and just be like, how are we even going to step into that arena? And I know Joaquin didn't look at the films for the same reason. He didn't want to be in the shadow of Jack Nicholson and Heath Ledger and Jared Leto. Even what he did, I thought was different but equally radical. So all of us just chose not to look back in that way. So Scott, going back to the script, we just decided to go on what we really knew from the memory of Joker and, you know, what we knew about him.
So you mentioned having a lengthy prep. What were the first steps for you guys once you read the script and you were on board? What were your initial conversations like in terms of figuring out if there were any kind of guiding principles that you wanted for the visual style?
I mean, early, the only thing, whether it's a function of the fact that we've done 6 films together, or even like in the early stages, I think our conversations are pretty short and often like one thing. Like I think after reading it and talking about it, we both like we'll hit on something that has nothing to do with big, it's big, but it's like it feels like 185, and we're like, totally, it feels like 185. So like mark that off the list. And then he's like, and we're gonna 100% shoot film, and I'm like, done. And then and we shot digital, but no.
And it's 240.
Yeah, exactly. But so like that was like, and then it was just like, listen, it's a character study, and it was early enough, and I mean this was maybe a full almost a year before we shot. So at that point, it's like me just sinking in and dreaming about it and thinking about things, and sometimes like Todd will just say one thing, and then that'll just begin an entire process of my brain kind of scrambling around with that for a little while. And sometimes, like he said something about, I feel like there's a certain sense of, this is about the two sides of ourselves and the shadow side, and our, sometimes is the shadow leading us, or we leading the shadow, and blah, blah, blah. And he just said it kind of offhandedly, and then I wrote like a whole manifesto email to him, and he's like, Jesus, that sounds so film schooling. And I was like, right, okay. It won't, but I think that's even probably similar to his process, or even an actor's process, when you really try to get cerebral about it. You don't want any of that to show up on screen. You want it to be, we always drive everything from a place of like, not really showy, super subtle, and realistic. And anytime something feels too self-conscious, we get really, it just stands our hairs up on our head, and we just go, no, let's not do that. But it was like, at the very least, in the same way as I prep anything, I'm still trying to build an arc visually, whether it's through like some lighting notes and things like that. So that shadow idea still existed for me, but it just did it in subtle ways. It was never really that transparent, hopefully. But it helped guide decisions as the movie progressed, and when you're shooting a movie out of order, it helped like at least define maybe a direction in each scene we could go with the lighting.
I want to get back to a couple other things you said there. One was the whole thing about shooting 185, because if my memory is correct, I think like all the Hangover movies are scope, but I think pretty much everything.
All of them were spherical 239.
So I'm curious, is it just purely intuitive, or were there sort of intellectual reasons behind why you guys thought this one should be 185?
I mean, for me, it was a reason that every movie we made about a group of people, and this was a movie about one guy. So one guy just felt more right in 185, and also the vertical world of Gotham felt more correct. So I think that was the first instinct was, Hangover, there's three guys in the frame, you want to go to that wider frame and fit all three in a 3-shot, but for this there's so many singles. Joaquin is 98% of the movie, it's Joaquin Phoenix, so it just naturally felt, although I had not shot 185 ever except my very first movie. I had always said to him, we're never shooting that, I hate 185. And then I said, I think on this one we should do 185.
I know, I felt the same way without even talking. So in that regard it was good, because it wasn't like, it both came to us, I think, in that intuitive way of like, it just felt like what the movie should feel like. Maybe it's also, I don't even know if I went back to some of those early character studies of the 70s and 80s, if they weren't a slave to this like, widescreen format, which I love, of course, but they weren't as adhering to that as we are now in that way.
And you also said, that you guys initially were like, oh, it's going to be on film, and then shot digitally. Take me through the process of like, what were the conversations like talking about shooting on film, and then how did you end up doing large format digital?
Yeah.
You want me to take it? Yeah. I mean, I can do it in the way that I sort of saw it, which is we were shooting 35, we were testing it, and we were doing all that. And I think a little bit of a combination of, one, I had a really good experience shooting the Arri 65 and Godzilla, and understood this kind of, I'll take you back to one of our also early discussions was, let's shoot 70 millimeter, like let's shoot large format film. And so I think we got kind of talked out of it by the studio because of cost and the fact that we were shooting in New York and the labs in LA, and things that even on a movie this size, which is not huge, but it's also not nothing, it still mattered enough that they basically took me in a room and slapped me in the face and said, stop talking to Todd about shooting like
Large format film.
Yeah, they were like, stop talking about it. It's not going to happen. We just said Wonder Woman can't do it, so you're not doing it either. But I think that idea of what that meant, whether it was just like how it could help with the character study aspect of this movie, lingered a little bit. And then I think understanding the way in which maybe this movie was going to be shot, maybe with Todd getting to know Joaquin a little bit more, understanding the sort of not improvisational way in the way that you think of like improvisation, but the fact that we would never really rehearse or have marks, and how that would benefit the movie and benefit Joaquin. I think Todd at least brought up the possibility late, because we were 11th
Like 2
hour.
weeks before we started shooting.
And said, what if we just tested it? And we brought a 35mm camera out and an Arri 65 camera, and we went out on to those stairs.
Even though I've seen a zillion tests, film versus digital tests, like we've all seen, we wanted to do our own on the actual locations where we would be shooting. So we brought 2 cameras out to the stairs at night with no lights, to Chinatown with no lights on the Manhattan Bridge, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
And we went and looked at the footage, and we talked about the pros and cons of each, and that was really where we decided, okay, we're going to go with this large format digital. The large format really is what convinced me, I have to say. If it
that
wasn't
pushed it over the edge.
That pushed it over the edge. Those ability with the depth of field and the lenses that we were able to get and use changed everything. So that really was the deciding factor.
And then it was like, okay, if that's going to happen, then my number one objective was that we weren't going to be sitting in the DI or even earlier than that throughout shooting, and Todd was going to feel disappointed or compromised by the fact that we did shoot that way. So then I just used all of my experience with digital that I have to this point, which is not that much. Most of what I've shot is on the film, to just even go further in trying to make it feel as film-like and chemical as possible, and give Todd the same look and feel that he was looking for if we kept shooting film. So that was like a real objective of mine, and that came from even our makeup hair tests, in terms of like setting something that was like a LUT that was very specific and had the right contrast, the right color, all these things that we worked really hard with. But I do remember even in the makeup hair test feeling like, oh wait, suddenly it was like Todd wasn't like upset.
Which is very rare.
That's right.
I'm upset right now about it.
He's still like, oh. So I was like, okay, good. Like the makeup hair test was a huge step just to get through that, of like feeling like, oh, this feels like the movie. You know?
That's true.
And what did the large format give you in terms of the close-ups? Because I feel like this movie, there's so many great close-ups of Joaquin, and there's something, I can't put my finger on it, and I'm not a technician, so I don't know exactly what you did, but there's just something so intimate about the close-ups. I mean, does that come from the lenses you're using? Is it the large format? How do you achieve that?
Well, inherently, the biggest benefit of a large format is that suddenly you now can be proximity-wise 2, 3, 4 feet from an actor, which has a psychological effect on the audience. But you're not on a 27mm lens. Let's say now you're on a 58mm lens. So you have this depth of field and the compression of a 58, but the field of view of a 27. So suddenly, you're not having this really narrow, compressed sort of thing. You're actually getting him in his world, and you're able to see the world around him. But you have almost this like live 3D.
It
It's
just
like natural
added a
3D.
level of intimacy to the movie, I think, that really put it over the top for me once we started getting into the nitty-gritty of the benefits of it, right?
Yeah.
The intimacy is, I think, really what it felt like.
And I think that intimacy is also just proximity, and that's the big thing. Is suddenly you're not on an 85, 6 feet away, but you can be, to have something that feels a bit more compressed and not wide lensy, because we're not super into that feel. So I think that already gives it a quality and an intimacy that I think is subconscious to the audience, but has a real effect. And that depth of field or lack thereof gives it this depth that's really beautiful in the way things fall off behind there. And so you're separating your character in their world, but you're actually seeing the world as well. So you're not separating them with compression, you're separating them with depth of field or lack thereof.
Something that I think is pretty consistent across all of your collaborations, but especially in this movie, is the performances are always really, really strong. And I'm curious, what kind of environment you guys try to create to facilitate the best work from the actors? Like you were sort of you mentioning that you didn't have marks for Joaquin. I mean, what other kinds of things did you do, and how did the way Joaquin worked sort of inform what the visual style of the movie ended up being?
Well, I don't know that the way he worked informed the visual style, but I do think the way we always work, or the way I've always worked, is you giving room to actors, and I have a really intimate relation with the actor. And why I love working with Larry and his whole crew is Larry and I, and one of the reasons I love the long prep time, is we've talked enough about the movie before we start shooting the movie that I don't necessarily need to be on top of Larry, next to Larry while we're shooting the movie. We've had those discussions. There's a zillion decisions still that we'll make on the day, but I could really be off with Joaquin and trust that Larry is running the crew and getting kind of what we talked about, and when it veers off, we'll have a little sidebar about it. But there's a trust there that really enables sort of for Joaquin and I to dive deep into it. But I wouldn't say that his style was dictating the way we shot the movie. We just always tend to leave it a little bit free for the actors to kind of feel their way around. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think in a way, like making this movie was not that different than the 5 previous movies. It was a progression to that, and maybe Joaquin, both the character and the way he also, I think, got into our style of filmmaking, which is involves, let's say, shooting a master. And we love shooting things from top to bottom. So every piece of coverage we'll do, we always shoot the whole scene, right? Because in doing that, we're not just picking off this shot, then equals that shot next to this shot. It's like every shot has the opportunity to discover moments that necessarily didn't plan out. And so my number one objective, and we've just come to do this for each other, is if we can get the master and sort of figure out what the scene is, then all the coverage we try to shoot as quickly as possible with the least amount of time in between, so that the rhythm and the energy of whatever we've discovered carries on as fast as possible. And so a lot of it is just about lighting the space in a way that we can shoot as 360 as possible, and then just giving the freedom so that he can change things on a dime, and it's not going to disrupt the entire apple cart and suddenly be like 4 hours in the trailer while we wait to do something. So it's really about shooting quickly, which we both like to do. Todd doesn't like too long days, which we love, and he likes to shoot quickly. I think the amazing thing is, in a world in which there are literally planned 3-4 weeks of reshoots on major movies, we've done 6 movies, we've done 2 additional days of photography. One was to shoot like literally establishing shots.
I see it as a sign of failure.
I think it's amazing.
I can't. No, meaning a sign of failure to go and have to do reshoots.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So I just can't do it. But it's like it mentally kills me. Like to call the actor up and go, "What are you doing in March?" After they've already been done.
But more so, even I do remember because we shot this movie in a couple days less than what they had sort of initially said or what we initially had. But he did make a real point, which is in the last 2 weeks of shooting, is that there will be no reshoots on this movie because there's no way Joaquin loses that weight again. And then
that was the other reason.
And I went, oh my God, you're absolutely right. Like, even if you wanted to, this is like, and then it became like anything we even thought of, we had to do in the time we had left.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so
this was a specific, unique situation because I knew he was never going to lose that weight again.
Well, I wanted to ask you, Todd, about the editing process, because today I was watching the Blu-ray of the movie, and there are these sort of montages of just footage of Joaquin where it seems like he did a lot of different kinds of things. Like, it seems like for everything you guys had, there were a lot of different takes, a lot of different ways he would play it.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how difficult that made the editing process and how much, how many things you had to try to get to.
It didn't make it difficult. I mean, that's like an embarrassment of riches when you have an actor give you something 6 different ways, even just a line. I think the thing on the Blu-ray is him coming out of the Murray curtain, and we show like 13 different takes of it. But to me, that's a great thing because now we have 13 ways to play with it. It does make you think there's probably mathematically 1 trillion different versions of this movie with somebody like Joaquin. But I'm also kind of used to it with a lot of the comedies that I've done, Will Ferrell, Zach Galifianakis. It's the same kind of thing. They don't necessarily do it the same way over. There's room to try stuff. So I don't know that it makes the editing harder. In a weird way, we just have a lot of stuff. I mean, you do have to go through a lot, but it's generally with Joaquin, it was all pretty interesting. So to me, that's what the director's job is, right? You're just the balancing, you're the purveyor of tone. So it's about, Joaquin might think this is cool in this scene to try it this way, but now that you're putting it in order, you realize, oh no, that's way too much for Arthur at this point in the movie. But it's not Joaquin's job to think of that. That's why you're there directing it, you know? So you have to protect the actor in that. While something might be great, it's just not where Arthur is yet in the movie, you know?
And did you have a pretty firm idea of what the tone was going to be right from the beginning, or did it evolve? Did it get either darker or lighter than you thought it was going to be?
No, I mean, the tone is the one thing. When I've thought of the idea of the movie and started writing it, the tone has been pretty consistent throughout, which is bleak. But everybody says it's such a nihilistic movie, and I go, it's the movie's not nihilistic at all. It's actually about the it's the outcome of living in a nihilistic society. It's not the movie isn't really nihilistic. It's just this is what happens when society is nihilistic.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting movie
That's
because, like a lot of period films, it's both about the time in which it takes place and it's about now. And I'm curious, like, why did you set it in 1981? And I know it's Gotham, but it's clearly New York. So like, why did you set it in 1981 New York?
Well, for a lot of reasons. I mean, one of the big stumbling blocks with the studio was one of their big resistances to the movie was, well, it's going to complicate other things we're doing in DC. So one way, which was totally mercenary, was just like, no, this takes place before everything else. It's an alternate universe. It's 1981. So this is not about Suicide Squad or even Nolan stuff. This is its own thing. Another reason is I hate technology in films. I hate cell phones and things. There's simple reasons of just like, let's just set it in the past. We don't have to deal with a lot of nonsense. But yeah, it takes place in 1981, but we wrote it in 2016 and 2017. So clearly, it's to me, movies are often mirrors for what's going on in society. So while it takes place then, to me, it's very much about what's going on now.
And my theory is Reagan decimated the mental health in America.
But he did. I mean,
He
that's
did
a fact.
in the 80s.
Yeah.
So that's what I like to believe.
Well, also New York in particular in 1981 was the most violent
Right.
year, right? It was a rough time in New York. So there was a lot about borrowing it, but that was the main reasons. Those were the main reasons.
I think we've got time for a couple of questions from the audience, if anybody has any.
This seems to be an almost perfect movie.
Wow, thank you.
There
As a plant.
anything like the setup or scene or any tone music, anything at all that you wish you'd done different, either one?
Can you hear that in the back?
He said, "Is there anything we wish we did differently?" He said, "This seems to be a perfect movie." And then he said, "You seem to be a perfect director. Is there anything that you wish you did differently after watching it?" I don't know for you. Is there stuff that you look at on your end?
No. I mean, that's always been my thing. Is I try to there's like 4 or 5 scenes I hate, and then it's like each movie I try to get that down to the fewest. I don't really have as many.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, there is a lot of stuff I think we did wrong that we cut out of the movie, or that just didn't fit. Again, that progression of tone. The movie's a slow burn. I mean, it really is. You know, we start at 0, and what's great about Joaquin is where he ends up in the movie, but it really goes from 0 to 11, his character, but over 2 hours of the movie. So it's like one click at a time, like point 1, point 2, point 3, and so some of that stuff we cut out just like didn't fit the slow burn of it or something. But there's nothing in the movie that drives me crazy. It probably is, but I can't think of it right now. I haven't seen it in a while. I haven't seen it since Venice Film Festival in August, and so I don't remember.
There's one thing I had. No, and it's more like that thing of like you wish you could have the alternative thing is we never talked about the other movies. We never talked about comics at all. And I think because the only real remnant of like connective tissue is the alleyway. And I remember we were like, oh, we got to do this alleyway scene. It's like in every one of these movies. Maybe we should watch those. And I remember I watched like a compilation on YouTube, and I wish I hadn't.
Oh,
because the movie, I like the fact that we weren't really influenced, except in our memory of what Nolan did or the other ones did. But that one I had actually seen it, and then I was like, oh, the fucking pearls and this. I mean, I still like the scene.
Well, we did
but I
that
almost
intentionally.
wish- yeah,
I mean,
exactly,
that was
right.
also intentional. The close up of the pearls going. That is the thing from
That we knew we're doing it so that we can
Right.
basically, that's the one tie-in.
Right.
And I wish I almost hadn't looked at any of them on
Right.
YouTube. That's again, it's
Interesting.
mild only to know like what would have been different, if
That's
anything.
interesting.
Maybe not. Just having that influence at all.
Good
Otherwise,
question,
it's
though,
pretty
'cause
pure. Yeah.
nobody asked that. I've been to a
Yeah.
lot of Q. Nobody's asked that.
Right.
But this is also a more technical crowd, right? I hope we didn't bore everybody with all that 185 talk, but because we're at Arri, so I feel like we could do that. This is a different crowd than usual.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's James. I think it was fantastic as well. I just moved here from New York and work as a cameraman. I've lived in New York for the last 40 years, so you guys captured the essence of New York 1981 so perfectly. The subways with the lights blinking on and off,
Mm-hmm.
the graffiti, and Bernard Getz. I think there was
Oh, yeah.
that was a very Bernard Getz scene.
Mhm.
Bernard Getz was a individual like.
He was a subway vigilante.
Yeah.
Yes.
Google it. Google it.
So people picked on him, and he pulled out a very big gun and just started shooting. And he left the subway. And yes, he became sort of a symbol for a lot of people that just were going through the same thing. And was that part of your writing?
I mean, I grew up in New York, and we remember Bernard Getz. There's a couple. This movie to me is a very New York Post movie. There's a lot of things that could have been on the cover of the New York Post or were on the cover of the New York Post. I remember in the draft of the. I mean, it's a horrible thing to invoke, but Bernard Getz was famous when he went up to the last guy he shot and he said, "Hey, you don't look so bad. Have another." I don't know if you remember that. It's a crazy thing. And he shot the guy in the back. I had that in our script. Joaquin goes to me, "This doesn't seem like Arthur to say that. It's like a little Dirty Harry." I'm like, "Yeah, I don't know. I'd take that out." But it was more like, so some of it was, I forget so yes. There was a lot inspired by New York at that time. I mean, Bernard Getz, I think, was 85, maybe 84, 85, 86.
Yeah.
But even the idea of the rats and the garbage strike and there's just a lot of things in the.
It was the Wild Wild West back then.
Yeah, it seemed like it.
Yeah, it was anything.
And the trains with graffiti that really looked like that. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen photos if you haven't been there at the time, but yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we used to call it the jungle back when my parents would let us go to the jungle.
Right.
I wanted to know how you filmed this. Did they let you in the subway to film all that and talk about the difficulty of doing it?
In case you couldn't hear in the back, the question was about filming in the subway and how you guys did that.
We have a couple sequences on the subway. So the one at the end where he's being chased by the cops, we shot that on a live subway. The MTA in New York let us on the subways, and they were pretty good about it. Gave us one track and one half of a platform. And then the subway murders, we shot primarily on stage. Larry introduced me to this, which I'll let him speak about, this incredible LED screen thing out the windows, which some people here might have seen before. I never worked with that before. You did it on Godzilla, I think?
A little bit, but I mean, basically, Todd had always described that scene as sort of a fever dream, and we knew that we needed full control, not just to be able to turn the lights off inside, but we wanted some control of what was happening outside the subway cars too, and we thought about doing it live because that's kind of where we always go to. And then we thought, well, we needed even more control than that. And then you go to some solutions like, is it blue screen out there? And there's some downsides to that, or is it just lighting, but against black? But I think what we really wanted was to really feel like we were traveling down the tracks. So we put LED screens, and then all on both sides of a subway car on stage, and they're like 15 feet high, 12 feet away from the car, and they're
That's just for the inside of the subway car. When he goes out and shoots the
That's
kids,
right.
that was a closed down subway platform in 9th Avenue in Brooklyn. It was a track they haven't used in years, and they let us go down there and fire off the fake gun and all that stuff. But on the train, when you're inside the subway car where he kills the 3 kids, the 2 boys, that's the LED.
That's
car.
right, and so then you have to put media out there that would basically be like a station you're passing by, or lights,
Or
even
another
the
train.
station you're pulling, or another train passing by. And so we basically, because we couldn't even shoot the plates to get that information, because they wouldn't let us into the subways to shoot the plates, so we did that with stills, under the theory of 24 frames a second, and created these long panoramics. Imagine like a really long slit panoramic, and then put that onto a media. And then while Todd and our A operator Jeff Haley and Joaquin and 3 other boys in the scene were the only ones on the car, and then I was outside basically like pushing buttons to have like a white train pass by, or
a rave.
Yeah, exactly. And I turned the lights off and just watch the scene and just do it in real time. So at any given moment we could have like the lights turn off and have another bit of activity outside that would bleed light inside. So it was a much more complex sequence than hopefully it looks like.
Yeah, it was cool though.
Yeah, like even though
That was the
even
most
like,
advanced thing they did.
exactly.
I
It was the most
was like, this is
technological.
crazy. I thought
Yeah,
it was
it's true.
Star Wars. It was amazing.
Well, when you were on there, it did feel like you got a little nauseous, and it felt like you were howling.
That's right. Yeah.
And then we would literally slow it down, like when the woman gets off, and that's just the thing, just slowing down to a stop, and then picking up speed again. And
That's cool.
yeah, all that.
I think we're running low on time. We could probably squeeze in one more. If you guys want to pick.
Thank you. Michael Wayne James.
Hello.
The clicking of Joaquin's character as he took that moment to suffocate his mother. That was pretty dark. That was very dark.
Mm-hmm.
Man, that's it really twisted things up quite a bit for me emotionally.
I'm sorry. Oh, okay.
No, it's good.
I'm sorry about
He
that.
loves his mother.
Yeah.
All right, well, that was quick. We could probably squeeze in one more.
That wasn't really a question. It was more of a comment.
How about up there in the back?
Hi there. I've watched the film 4 times. It's my favorite movie of the year.
Wow, thank you.
Dying to know if the love interest is if she's real or a fragment of imagination for him.
Well, you've seen it wait. Well, I mean, she's real in that she lives down the hall, but they never had a relationship. You know that,
Right.
right? So she's real, but the relationship is a figment of is a delusion,
Okay.
right?
I've had some about that, so I'm very happy that you cleared that
But
up.
didn't you know that when he had the flashbacks and he sees and he's really there alone,
We didn't catch that.
even on the 3rd time?
Well, I was actually wondering this time. I was thinking, at the end, like the whole movie could be, he's such an
Well,
unreliable
that's what I
narrator.
actually thought you were getting at. Is a lot of people ask, is like, what of the movie? Because we are playing with A, his delusions, and B, his fantasies. He sees himself in the beginning on Murray. Well, it's not a delusion. He's having a fantasy. But then it switches to delusions with the girl. So a lot of people say, well, what are you saying with the movie? Did the movie happen? Did the movie not happen? I mean, to me, it's clear. But, I don't want to say because it does affect the way, but yes, go ahead, sorry.
Did you write the script with Joaquin in mind?
We did, yeah. I love Joaquin. I hadn't known him personally, but, his work, we all know he's just one of the greatest of his generation. And when I pitched it to Warner's, I literally said, well, okay, imagine Joaquin Phoenix and da-da-da. So he was always the guy and was just saying, yeah, he really is perfect for it. I know, he is. I love him.
All right, well,
Oh.
you want to keep going? You want to do
Well, no,
one or two more?
Larry's got to get on it.
Yeah, Larry's got to get on a
I had
plane.
a question.
No, I'm not answering your question. You can ask me questions any time. Go ahead.
There's news about the Joker 2, so are you writing the script? Or hard question.
Joaquin wouldn't lose weight for reshoots. You think he's going to lose weight for a sequel? We're not there.
You'd be older.
Yes.
All right, well,
That's great. Thank you.
yeah, I'm going to let you guys go so Larry can catch his plane. But thanks, Todd Phillips and Lawrence Sher, everybody.